Okay, so hopefully everybody's logged on and everyone can see us. It does say that we have gone live. Just want to say hello to everybody and welcome to the very first TherapistsConnect broadcast. For anyone who doesn't know, TherapistsConnect is an open community of therapists across the world, and our aim is to kind of talk about and debate issues around therapy and issues that impact on the therapy community. We've mainly been based on Twitter, but this is our first live broadcast. And if you are interested in the debates that we're having today, you can find out more information at our website, which information is running across the bottom of the screen now. For those people who don't know me, my name is Peter Blundell, and I'm a lecturer at Liverpool John Moores University. I teach on the Masters in Person-Centred and Experiential Counselling and Psychotherapy. I have been a very vocal critic of the SCoPE project throughout 2019, but I believe it's really important that as therapists that we are talking about this issue and debating it to make sure that everybody is informed about what's going on and the potential impacts on our profession. So today I see myself as a facilitator of this panel discussion, along with my co-host, Kaz. Kaz, I don't know if you want to introduce yourself.
I will, thank you, Peter, and just welcome everyone. It's really great to be here today. So for anyone who doesn't know me, my name is Kaz Binstead, and I'm a registered therapist and supervisor working in private practice in London. So I've been involved in a variety of things during my career, including writing different mediums, the education field, and currently co-run Trainee Talk, #TraineeTalk with Peter for TherapistsConnect. I was also recently host of National Counsellors Day and am an avid supporter of the rights of all registered therapists gaining paid work. And I specialise in helping people who are new to private practice. I just want to go over and declare any potential conflicts of interest in the same way that Peter has. So first of all, I have been affiliated with a BACP accredited course. And I am also an executive sitting on the BACP private practice division. But I want to stress that not that I'm really giving any opinions today, but anything I say is my own personal view and is not at all the view of the BACP or the division. Finally, I wrote a critical analysis paper last year based on the first iteration of SCoPEd, which came from the perspective of me being an avid supporter of the register and potentially some form of regulation. And I didn't believe SCoPE to be the right framework last year. So I hold the same view as Peter, that I really think that discussion in the profession is so essential. It's so important that we talk about this. So yeah, let's all get our kind of best reflective counselling hats on today, and hopefully it's going to be a good chat. So I think a really good place to start would be, if I hand back to Peter, maybe you could give a little bit of an overview about what SCoPE project is and why it's really important that we're here today. There's going to be a lot of people watching who maybe don't have a lot of idea of what it's about or need a lot more information. We're really bearing that in mind. Before I continue, I just want to say there's a lot of things to talk about with SCoPE, which include the spelling of it. Like there's lots and lots of capital letters, who the hell knows where they go, but also the pronunciation of it. Some people say SCoPEd, some people say SCoPEd. We're going to go for SCoPEd. Peter and I have decided anyway, the panelists can do whatever they like. So yeah, I'm going to just hand back to Peter to give a bit of an overview.
Thanks, Kaz. Okay, so I'm gonna say SCoPEd today. Okay, everyone can use the pronunciation whatever they wish. So for those people who don't know, SCoPE stands for the Scope of Practice and Education. And the BACP states that the project aims to agree an evidence-based framework to inform the training requirements, competencies and practice standards for counsellors and psychotherapists who are working with adults. The project is a collaboration between three organisations, the BACP, UKCP and BPC. On the 14th of July this year, the second iteration of that project was released. The official documentation on the project states that this new version of the framework has taken into account the response from the members and stakeholders who were consulted in 2019. Although this framework still remains in draft format, okay, so it's not complete. We did reach out as an organisation to all three of those membership bodies to ask if they wanted to send a representative to talk about the project and answer any specific questions. We haven't received a reply from BPC, but we did receive a reply from the BACP and UKCP. The BACP felt that it was important that members digested the scope documentation, which includes the framework, methodology paper, and case studies before they engaged in any further debate. They stated that they were planning on holding further discussions and debates regarding the scopes project, although these would likely be the BACP's own events rather than through another organisation such as, say, TherapistsConnect. The UKCP replied to us on social media and they advised us they didn't have anyone available to attend this debate. We replied asking if they had any representatives attending any public debates on scopes during this consultation period, but we have yet to receive a reply from them. Okay, so we've got a selection of people on the panel today. We tried very, very hard to reach out to all our social media networks, all our therapy networks, to make sure that we had a wide variety of views on the panel. Some people were interested in coming along, but they weren't able to come at the time of the debate, whereas other people were worried about coming on a live panel and sharing their views about scopes in a public forum. We've got lots of questions that were sent to us and discussion points from lots of different therapists, some people asking to be anonymous. Many of these questions related to technical aspects of scope. For example, where people sat within the structure, what would happen in certain circumstances. Now, we don't have any representatives from any of the organisations, so we can't answer those technical questions. Okay, it's not fair for the panel to try and engage with those questions. So we suggest that anyone with those type of questions raise them with their membership body, okay, either in the consultation process or emailing or contacting them directly. We searched for a wide variety of panelists, and we did seek somebody who was a completely pro-scoped, who had pro-scoped views, but we couldn't find anyone willing to attend or who was available at this specific time. Despite this, though, we've got panelists with a wide variety of views, okay, so I think they will cover quite a lot of the different points that we need to talk about with regards to the scoped project. Okay, I feel that was a really long introduction. Kaz, maybe if I come to you, maybe you could introduce our panel members.
Yeah, definitely. Well, long, but I think really, really important. So yeah, I'm just going to introduce everybody. Obviously, these are the important people here today, the panelists. So first up, we have Erin Stevens. So Erin is a counsellor, psychotherapist and writer in private practice in Ilkley, West Yorkshire. She is a member of the PCSR steering group, which is Psychotherapists and Counsellors for Social Responsibility, and has been a prominent scoped campaigner since submitting the scrap scoped resolution to BACP in 2019. And then we have Rima Sidapara. So Rima is a BACP accredited psychotherapist and clinical supervisor with 15 years experience in the profession. She is practice director of Rutland House Counselling and Psychotherapy Limited, based in Leicester, and leads a diverse team of 40 therapists. Rima is deputy chair of the executive of the BACP Private Practice Division. However, again, it's important to stress that she's here representing her own personal views and not in any way the views of the BACP or the division. And also, she's clearly my colleague as well, so I'll be giving her a really hard time today. So next up, Andy Rogers. So Andy has been a counsellor and a non-accredited BACP member for over 20 years. He trained on the University of East Anglia's postgraduate diploma in the late 1990s and for many years worked as a counsellor and counselling service coordinator in further and higher education. Andy has written articles and book chapters on person-centred therapy and professional politics, and for a while was Ethical Dilemmas editor for Self and Society, a journal for humanistic psychology. He now runs a private counselling and supervision practice in Basingstoke, Hampshire. And then we have Jay Beichman. And Jay has been a practicing counsellor and therapist since 1998. Whilst training and for some time after, he also worked as a mental health project worker. He has published various texts, including articles about William Blake, Thomas Suz, pluralistic therapy, and William James. His PhD thesis was about how therapists make sense of pluralistic approaches to therapy. The thesis, as well as being about pluralistic therapy, also covered issues around research, professionalisation, regulation, audit culture, NICE, IAPT, and CBT. And then finally, we have Dr. Emma Radway-Bright. And Emma is a counsellor and psychotherapist in private practice at her practice I Need Therapy. And she is based in South East London, offering online sessions via video link as well. She works with people who are experiencing depression, stress, anxiety, and the general pressures of modern day living. Her specialist area is trauma, big and small, and she works with people to resolve the emotional, physical, and behavioural effects of any trauma they have experienced in the past or more recently. She believes that there are many amazing counsellors and psychotherapists in the UK working to support mental health, and passionately believes that all counsellors, regardless of their route to professional training, should be paid for their work. So that's our panel. So just a couple of things, panel. First of all, we're going to ask you to be, when you answer, to just be as clear as you can about what it is you're talking about, just bearing in mind that some people won't necessarily know certain things about the document. And if Peter or I feel that anything needs further clarification, we might just jump in and ask you to explain a little bit more, right? Secondly, obviously, we want this to be a really interesting and engaging discussion. So just asking that you really stay on scoped policy and comment on that. And just be aware of being respectful, hearing each other out. It's fine to get animated, it's fine to get emotional. This is an emotional topic after all. But yeah, just bear in mind that kind of word, respect. I think that's probably it, isn't it? So should we crack on with the questions, Peter?
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Kaz. So just before we ask the questions, I'd just like to highlight that as we're talking about the SCoPEd project, obviously we may end up talking about specific membership bodies. If any of the panelists are talking about the membership bodies and they're highlighting a reason why they want to talk about something, just say why they specifically highlighted that specific membership, just looking at the whole SCoPEd project as a whole. Okay. The first question we thought, which kind of eases us into this kind of discussion really, we thought we'd ask each panel member just what your initial thoughts are and reactions are into reading this second version of the SCoPEd project before we kind of get into the detail of it. Okay. So the first person I was going to come to was Andy. If you can maybe just give us a bit of an overview of what your thoughts were in terms of the SCoPEd project.
Yeah, well, firstly, it feels really good to be here and talking with people who are really just Twitter acquaintances. So that's really good. But well, I suppose when I first saw the new iteration was coming out, I just had this kind of sense of gloom, really. That I'm going to have to sort of muster some kind of energy to engage in what's in the document and the various sort of machinations around it, and try and kind of make sense of this thing. And these things take energy, and with everything going on in our world right now, it felt like, well, have I got room for this? Have I got room to, you know, read through this kind of densely bureaucratic sort of document and kind of make sense of it and of what it means? But I suppose I felt a kind of responsibility having been quite engaged in the critique last year about the first iteration. So yeah, so I just tried to sort of dive in really, and I didn't really feel much about it. It just sort of met my expectations, I suppose, which is that there had been some tinkering with language as a way of you know, answering at some level the critiques from last year. And then there's this sort of manoeuvring around how the paths, which I think we're going to come on to discuss, like how the paths between these columns or titles, as they were originally, yeah, how that operates. So there's been some sort of small changes, but it was just a bit kind of depressing really to sort of see this thing and it not be significantly different. But I suppose I also feel kind of heartened and that, you know, that there's people who are willing to stand up and discuss this critically, you know, and to evaluate it and really examine it in depth, kind of interrogate it a bit, and to put their heads above the parapet and kind of talk about it openly and talk about their concerns, and that we've got a forum to do that, whether that's here right now or on social media, and that we don't just have, for example, the letters pages of Therapy Today. So, and having been around for like 20 years in the profession, it's really heartening for me to see that there's a sort of a generation of therapists coming through who are really active and want to take on the big kind of political issues in our profession. So yeah, I mean, all that was going on for me while I was trying to digest this thing.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think I agree completely with what you're saying there in terms of at least giving an opportunity to kind of talk and discuss and go through this whole project to kind of really reflect on what it's about and kind of where it's coming from. Erin, can I come to you and just give us your initial thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I was unsurprised by it really. It was pretty much like Andy says, what I expected as well. Some minor kind of superficial changes, making some of the explicit implicit. So, for example, with the training routes, iteration 1 sort of explicitly said UKCP and BPC training for Tier C, whereas now that explicit link to those trainings has been removed, but the tier requirements still describe them. So I was unsurprised by the way that it feels kind of almost trying to sort of pacify kind of changes in language. I was quite surprised, and I think we're going to come on to this later, but I was quite surprised by the idea of taking the titles out to put them back in later. That surprised me a bit. And the other thing that really was a surprise was that working therapeutically with ruptures is still a Tier 3 competency, and that did surprise me. But other than that, it was pretty much what I expected.
Okay, thank you. And I think, yeah, we're definitely going to come on to discussing titles a little bit later on. Jay, if I could come to you for your first initial reactions.
Yeah. Okay. Well, for me, it's mostly about the BACP, actually. And I'm sorry if I'm not going at, you know, that you said something and I've got lots of interference about mentioning membership bodies. But for me, it's mostly about the BACP, because in my view, they're meant to represent both counsellors and psychotherapists, which you can't say is the same with the UKCP and the BPC. Because in some ways, I'm totally fine with the UKCP and BPC trying to advantage their own membership, because in a way that's their job. But in my view, BACP should value both titles of counsellors and psychotherapists equally. Also, in my view as well, this goes back to regulation. Back in 2009, one of the many reasons why statutory regulation, because there's two, you know, there's normal regulation and statutory regulation. But one of the reasons it failed back in 2009 is because when they sent, you know, experts off to try and work out what the difference between counselling and psychotherapy was, they couldn't do it. So, in a way, this SCoPEd project, in my view, is setting the groundwork for another go at statutory regulation, which I think they say themselves more or less, or imply it. So I think, in a way, you've got the issue of standards, and then you've got the issue of statutory regulation. And, there's a worry that they might be slipping this in statutory regulation, which is actually a related but different issue. And reasons I don't really understand, the PSA compromise, the Professional Standards Association, I think, doesn't seem to have been accepted by quite a few people, obviously, including those in these 3 membership bodies. That's
great. Okay, thank you. Rima, if I can come to you.
Hi, everybody. Well, I guess my initial reactions was there was such a long build up to the second version, and I guess opening this version, I did have a lot of expectations that it would be quite different to version 1. My learning style is that I did need to print it off. I couldn't just read it off a computer, and I had to sit with it for a while and offer some time to kind of digest it. And I would recommend others doing the same if you're struggling with sort of the level of content that's been thrown at us. That it does take some time to kind of get to grips with what is this about and how does it differ to version 1. I guess for me, what stood out was the removal of titles and changing it to a ABC category. And I think it had a bit of the opposite effect for me, in that it made me focus in more on the ABC titles rather than kind of move away from them. So I guess to summarize, it's left me with a lot more questions and answers, and I don't know how far we are from version 1, to be honest. But I think there has been a lot of thought gone into the feedback, I guess, and there has been some change in language to be a bit more inclusive. But I do think there's still a long way to go around the language and terminology used.
Okay, thank you. I think that was a really important point you made there in terms of people trying to understand the scope documentation, and actually there is a lot of it, and there's a lot of kind of commentary out there around the scope documentation, and actually to go through all that is quite a massive task. And so hopefully maybe we can break down some of that through these discussions today. Okay, can I come to you, Emma, just to get your kind of initial thoughts, please?
Well, my initial thoughts was it's very colourful, so they obviously have a really good comms and marketing budget to use on presentation. But essentially, to me, what it seems they've done is just basically taken the same principle and polished it up a bit. Changed the titles to the A, B, and C, but there isn't any real substance to indicate that they looked at it and looked at possible alternative models that they could have gone for. So to me, this displays a lack of flexibility of thought and ability to take feedback and look at something that might work better for the profession. And I concur with all the other comments from the rest of the panel as well.
Okay, thank you very much. Just before we move on to our next question, was there anything else that the panel kind of wanted to mention around their initial thoughts or feelings, or come back on anything that anybody else has said at this point? No? No.
I'll just mention something quickly, just picking up on something Jay said, because I think, Jay, you said that Peter kind of cut up a little bit when he was speaking about membership bodies. So just to reiterate what he was saying there, obviously this does have a different effect, or it could potentially have a different effect depending on which membership body you're in. So what we're asking today is if you may sometimes be generally speaking about scope policy, and sometimes you may be speaking very specifically about a particular membership body, which is completely understandable, and it's about holding membership bodies to account. But if you could just say which membership body you're referring to, as you did, Jay, there, and exactly why, then that would just be really useful for the listeners. Okay, so let's move on to our next question. So what issues do you think that SCoPEd is trying to solve, and do you think it succeeds? So we're going to come to Erin first.
Hi, Kaz, thank you. I'm going to be focusing on BACP, and there's two reasons for that. One is because I think they have been most vocal and visible. I've hardly heard anything really from BPC or UKCP. And also because at the time of the first iteration, they were my membership body, and I know most about them, and I know most about what it means for counsellors and psychotherapists. And I also think it's like the SCoPE framework's likely to impact most upon people who are members of the BACP. So that seems like an important focus. The difficulty in trying to figure out what SCoPE, I mean, the very fact that we have to ask what is SCoPE trying to solve at this stage tells us everything. I think one of the real difficulties has been that there has been no real clarity about what it's trying to solve, and that the narrative has shifted over time. So back in 2018, a technical group member of the SCoPE team, a BACP technical group member, said, "What SCoPE is doing is trying to prepare the landscape to enable us to respond in an informed way should statutory regulation appear on the agenda again." So that's what was being said in 2018. When the framework was presented to members, we heard a lot of, we're mapping what is out there, we're not trying to set new standards, we're just trying to map what's out there. We all heard that in the BACP videos that went out, and that's kind of what the narrative was. There's something in the latest iteration which appears to be different to that. It says, we started work by mapping competencies, and that SCoPE tries to find a shared way of representing the therapeutic work that counsellors and psychotherapists do. And I think that's a really important shift in language, because it doesn't rule out redefining what we do as part of developing a shared way of presenting it. So I think that is as another significant shift in what they're saying they're trying to do. And I think that's reflected in this new gateways thing that we're going to come on to talking about later. If the project is meant to unify the profession, I think it's fair to say that it's failed. I think it's been a very divisive project, and I think you'd be hard pushed to find someone, even within BACP, willing to say that it's been successful in unifying the profession.
Okay, thank you, Erin. So yeah, let's go to Jay next.
In terms of what I think it's trying, to do, I think there's a huge issue around paid employment, and you know, that Erin talks a lot about on social media and so forth. I think, you know, if you take some good faith, I think there is some people there thinking that this kind of scoped project might lead to more paid employment. I don't trust the NHS and IAPT that much. I basically think the NHS and IAPT have their own agenda completely, and counsellors and psychotherapists that aren't CBT, and you know, that's something to notice. You know, CBT has its own membership organisation that's nothing to do with this. They're basically being marginalised for whatever reasons. Well, there's lots of reasons, you know, that maybe talk about later. But I think a danger as well is there's all this emphasis on qualification when actually they want people who are less qualified, not more qualified. So I think in terms of the aim of paid employment, I think it misses the target there, really. And I think another aim is they, you know, if you take them in good faith, is to sort of have more credibility for counsellors and psychotherapists. I think the BACP and other organisations make too much of this. Basically, you know, if you know, in my everyday life, and say, you know, what do you do? I'm a counsellor, I'm a therapist. People know what it is. They think, oh, good for you. You know, that's a really good thing to do. You know, I mean, I think there's, you know, this sort of search for credibility. It's already there, you know. And I think they're also in kind of like audit culture terms looking for certainty and uniformity. Like, what is therapy? Certainly. How can it all be the same? Yeah. Where for me, therapy is by its nature completely uncertain, very multifarious, and I think that's a good thing. And we don't need to kind of be able to pinpoint, oh, it's exactly this. And it's always going to be the same. What social science called a McDonaldization. I think it's the McDonaldization of therapy. I think it's at least a paper, if not a book. You know, and that's what they're trying to do, so that all the hamburgers come out the same. And that's that's my view on what their aims are.
Thank you, Jay. Okay, Rima.
Okay, well, I guess my thoughts is it's trying to address quite a few things. Firstly, I've never seen in our profession membership bodies kind of talking to each other and collaborating, and I actually do see that as a positive, rather than everybody against each other. And I don't know what that's going to lead to. The framework feels a bit clunky at the moment, with sort of attaching UKCP and BPC to the end of the framework in category C, the way I see it. But I liked this idea of actually collaborating and talking together. And in the whole time I've been in the profession, this hasn't happened. But I do see that as a positive aim. However, I would like to see more voices being included, all stakeholders being included within that. And I'm not behind the scenes, so I don't know who's been included, who's not, but from seeing it from the outside perspective, I'm only seeing 3 membership bodies, and like I think it was Erin said, I think I'm only hearing from BACP, and I feel there's such a huge silence around the other 2 professional membership bodies, which I don't think is okay, actually. I think they need to be communicating how they're feeling about this. I think it's also trying to address the confusion within our profession, and I actually feel there is a lot of confusion around titles. There's loads of titles, lots of school of thought, and lots of diversity within our training, and it is confusing to navigate what all of that means. And I think it's great, the diversity within our profession is great, but I think it is hard to understand from a perspective of a client, an employer, and a new person that's entering the profession to train, and also existing therapists and trainees, like where we actually fit in our profession and what it means for us individually. So I really welcome the project actually opening up a conversation about it, and I see it as an ongoing process of reflecting and consulting and not putting us into boxes and a framework, actually allowing us to kind of breathe with this process and allowing us to talk to one another to really get to grips with what we want. And I do think that's important. Whether the current framework addresses the aims, I think is a big question mark. I don't think it does at this stage. Is it meant to? Is it sold in that way? I'm not sure. But from an employer perspective, you know, I run a service and I have been an employer myself, and I can really see putting therapists into 3 categories is only going to encourage employers to employ therapists from the B and C category. So what will happen to the A therapists? I'm concerned about that. I'm concerned that they're going to be left to volunteer or going to be thrown into private practice quite quickly because there's not going to be any employment opportunities. In terms of clients, I feel there's going to be more confusion with 3 titles rather than clarifying what it is that we're doing. And for trainees, I think it does help to have a pathway and an understanding, a start point and an end point. But again, I think there needs to be an honesty that if you're entering a category A, where is that going to leave you in terms of employment and opportunities going forwards?
Thanks a lot, Rima. Lots of points that you've made there. I think you said on Twitter recently that, you know, it was important for you to kind of just keep on reflecting on all of this. And that was really indicative in your answer, actually. And already we've heard a whole wide range of different views. But I love what you say about kind of feeling the need to breathe in all of this, because then when I hear your answer and everyone else's answer, oh goodness, there's a lot there, and that need to breathe feels so important. Who are we going to next? Emma.
Right. So the question is whether we think SCoPEd, what it's trying to solve, and I think the initial iteration, it did seem to be about demarcating between what a counsellor and a psychotherapist was and introducing some kind of hierarchy. So even though in this iteration they've taken away the titles, the A, B, and C is still a hierarchy that they seem to be introducing. But the fact is that if you wanted to demarcate that, you also, within that framework, had said level 4 is qualified. And qualified is qualified regardless. And I think if we go on that principle and look at other professions that work with clients or patients like doctors, once a doctor is qualified, they're qualified. And the only way to progress within the medical profession is through specialty training. But whether you have a master's that you do after you qualify as a doctor, or whether you have a PhD after you qualify as a doctor, you are still a doctor. To get to be a consultant, it's about experience and specialty training. And I think in a way, that's where these organizations have missed a trick in a way of talking about, yes, we've got a training framework. Yeah, I could have done that, you know, put together a table of all the different ways you could train to be a therapist, but that doesn't mean there's a hierarchy in therapy, because the person at the end of the day that is seen at level A, they're then saying, like, if we look at something like 1.12c, that somebody at level A is only capable at working as a team, but somebody at 1.12c can take an active role in the professional community, working locally and internationally, and, you know, they can impart professional knowledge and information. So what have I been doing when I've been at a webinar, you know, or giving a presentation? Does that mean that with this medium hierarchy, I won't be able to do that? Because I'll only be an A because I've only got a level 4. So that would always preclude me, even in employment, being able to give international presentations or giving my professional opinion. But my professional opinion comes from experience. It doesn't come from whether I did a level 7 or not. And I think it's just being very clear about what their intention is versus what they're actually achieving with their output, which I don't actually think they've done.
Okay, thanks a lot, Emma. Just to let you know, I sent you a private message as well. I'm not sure if it's your coverage or if it's your microphone. I could hear you, but you're just a little bit quiet, muffled. Okay. So I don't know whether anything can be done your end or not, but I just wanted to let you know. But just to go over, I mean, Emma was obviously talking there about the kind of what feels like a hierarchy to her, and, you know, whether that's really fair, particularly when we're not taking experience into account in that, and that if you're in a you know, column A, it wouldn't matter how much you're kind of doing in terms of, you know, CPDs and learning about very important stuff as a therapist, as well as building on your experience, that it would feel a bit like, you know, to the outside world that you were still level A. So yeah, let's move on. So lastly, Andy.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say much else about the sort of stated aims, because everyone else has sort of covered them so well, and particularly Jay's analysis of what stated aims are and whether they're, you know, important and useful and worthwhile. But for me, the framework does nothing potentially really to improve the field at all, because behind these sort of stated aims, there's, I mean, I'm sure the people involved feel they're doing, you know, the right thing for the profession. This isn't a criticism of people and what they're doing. But somehow the way the dynamics of the situation come together is to kind of try, as if it's trying to resolve the power dynamics in the profession. And these power dynamics exist around a number of areas, you know, like title, like the other people have already mentioned, the counsellor, psychotherapist, you know, it's like this age-old thing, you know, like who's better or is there a difference? The power dynamics between the organisations, which are really strange because BACP has a huge kind of membership, but other smaller organisations who occupy different places in the power hierarchy for reasons of history and therapeutic approach, seem to sort of have a kind of equal weight or even more weight somehow. And actually, these issues of modality, the power dynamics between modalities, you know, where psychoanalytic work has often been sort of positioned at the top. And I think we sort of come on to these issues a bit later. But to me, there's the sort of stated aims, and then there's the aims of the project at a sort of political level. Even if they're not sort of openly acknowledged, I don't know if the people in these meetings sort of planning these things actually talk about this stuff. But maybe they should, you know, maybe they should sort of explore what's going on at this level. You know, this is what we do, isn't it, as therapists, think through the sort of deeper aspects of things. Because the way that it's coming out now, the way it's been formulated, to me is a kind of betrayal, really, of the rich diversity of counselling and psychotherapy and therapeutic practice. And it seems strange, really, that therapists of all people, you know, would want to iron out complexity, yeah, to sort of like to make things simple and kind of put them into categories, so that they're more kind of accessible or something. I mean, I don't understand where that comes from for therapists, and especially to use such a blunt instrument as this kind of the methodology which is used to create this kind of competent frameworks, and the framework itself, you know, this kind of, here you are in your columns on a spreadsheet. You know, this seems to me sort of odds with therapeutic thinking, and I think someone said earlier about there seems to be an inability to think sort of critically, but also creatively, you know, about how we best sort of look after the work of counselling and psychotherapy, because that's what this is about, isn't it? It's about how do we look after this special thing that we all do in different ways? How do we take care of it? And I think there's a myth in SCoPEd that it's inevitable. Yeah, the thing has to happen. I mean, one of the people involved in BACP wrote that if we don't do scopes, then we'd sort of do nothing, or words to that effect, which seems to me just like I don't know where that kind of narrowness of thinking comes from, you know. And it's just scoped. We should remember, however powerful the organisation has seen, is just one way of understanding the field. It's one way of addressing the problems in the field, and it's one way of analysing what those problems are. And there are many, many other ways potentially we could do this, you know, that we can work together to take care of this work and look after not just its status and its legitimacy, but its heart, yeah, the sort of soul of the work. So yeah, if we're saying, is it solving the issues? I mean, you've got to say, well, what are the issues in the first place? You know, and do you take them, as Joe was saying, in good faith, or do you look below the surface a bit? Yeah, so I mean, I suppose that's where I am with that. I mean, it's a really tough question, isn't it? Like, is it solving it? Because it's, on what terms do you take that question? You know? So
yeah, absolutely. But you know, I guess what you said there, how do we look after this really special thing? How do we take care of it? I love that, and I guess that's why we're here today, isn't it? I'm going to invite you all to any further comments, anything you want to ask any of the panelists from what you've heard?
I think it was something Rima was saying about the level of consultation and how, for you, Rima, I think you were saying that it felt good that there was this kind of consultation between these bodies which were, you know, in conflict or certainly not speaking with each other in the past. But I think it's a very limited level of consultation, because it's a kind of a club who have set themselves up and excluded everyone else, and now they're talking about potentially talking to others. again, that seems a very strange approach to me for therapists who are interested in open thinking and reflective thinking and open engagement with a range of views, you know, to sort of cut out the National Counselling Society, for example. I mean, I've got no interest in that personally. I'm not a member, I'm a BACP member, but why not talk to everyone from the start? You know, why? What's the answer? I
agree with that. And I think for me, this feels like a massive step in our profession to have collaboration. I've never, like I said, I've not seen it before. But yes, it needs to be a wider net. It needs to be everybody, all stakeholders, including clients and employers and training institutes. Everybody needs to be involved in this, so that we can get a real sense of what we're all thinking about it.
There was a lot of questions from therapists regarding who was involved with this SCoPE project. And I know that in the methodology paper, there is something that is written about that, which I think it might be important just to read out. Limiting the mapping of practice standards to the 3 collaborating organisations. This decision was made because the focus was on finding shared agreement between the 3 participating bodies. It also became clear that the task of extending this wider would have been even more complex, and there were difficulties about establishing which bodies to include and how to get reliable data. This was therefore agreed to be outside the scope of the project. However, the technical group and the expert reference group recognised the limitations this places on the published framework and recognised that this could be extended at a later date. So I just thought that was important to kind of put that in there, because I think it is acknowledged in the methodology paper that there is limitations to that.
Mm-hmm. Anyone got any thoughts on that?
Well, it shows you that how the methodology is sort of driving the project. You know, we decide on a methodology, and then that excludes things, and I'm really sorry that can't be included. Yeah. But it's the methodology. There's a kind of circularity to that, which again feels problematic to me.
I'm not sure I buy it in the sense that if it was me, you know, what would the instinctive thing be to include everybody that's got anything to do with counselling and psychotherapy under the PSA? Because like it or not, and I think some people don't like it, the PSA is, if you like, where the authority to become a recognised counsellor and psychotherapist lies. I mean, through the membership bodies, but, you know, for credibility, they need to be a member of the PSA. So,
yeah,
you know,
yeah,
so why not the, it seems obvious.
I agree with you, Jack. I mean, the PSA is the obvious sort of thing, isn't it, to look at all the PSA accredited registers. And I think what it doesn't do is give a rationale for including BPC and UKCP over the other bodies. So I think it's, you know, I think if they're going to say, you know, this is a rationale for excluding X, Y, and Z, they also need to give the rationale for who was included.
Yeah, thanks, Erin. That's a really important point. For anyone who doesn't know, the PSA, the Professional Standards Authority, each membership body obviously has the register, and the register comes under the authority of the PSA. All right, Peter, do you want to move on to the next question?
Yeah, okay, so we'll start exploring some of these issues in a little bit more depth. So the next question, the SCoPE project has often cited the importance of mapping existing training and practice requirements of counsellors and psychotherapists. That's kind of been something at the forefront that it's been mentioned since the beginning. How accurately does the panel think that the second iteration of SCoPE represents the work and training of counsellors and psychotherapists in the UK? And if we could come to Jay first.
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of hours and things like that, the sort of more quantitative measures, if you like, the job is okay. You know, as someone else said, you know, not necessarily that complicated to kind of come up with these 3 columns and work out how many hours training and how many hours therapy and so forth. But in terms of what they think we know and don't know as counsellors and psychotherapists, I don't think it's as good. For instance, I'll just give you one example. They don't seem to think counsellors do PhDs, which I think would be news to a lot of counsellors that have PhDs.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Rima, what do you think of that question?
I think it was a useful starting point to see where the training field overall and sort of qualifications, hours, and how we vary in terms of supervision, personal therapy, what all these requirements are. So it's a useful to kind of as a starting point, but most definitely not as an ending point. And actually, I don't know if who, from the people that are on Twitter, but yesterday there's such a powerful thread about therapists coming forward and sharing their stories of how they entered the profession and what they went through personally. But the real grit that it takes to become a therapist. And I found it so powerful, and it actually makes me emotional right now thinking about it. Just that's missing, I think, the nuances in our stories. I would love our stories to be part of this. And I've got a story to share of how I became a therapist, and it's not what you might see is a therapist in category potentially in C with a master's and all the rest of it, but actually none of my journey's been kind of shown in this framework. And for me, I think that our journey as a therapist and what it takes us to be a therapist really needs to be at the heart of this project, so that employers can really understand us, clients can get what we're about in a sense, and have trust in our profession, and same for trainees. What's ahead, and sort of showing trainees what's the training journey going to involve. Because I had a quite a big warning from my trainers that said, this is really going to pull you apart, and we don't know how you're going to come back at the end of this training. And that really stuck with me, because you are transforming whilst you're on training, and that's not captured for me in this framework, and I'd love for it to be captured, and I think it can be captured, and that's why I don't see this as an end point. I would love to now add the heart and soul of who we are onto this map.
Thank you. I think that's a really interesting point. And I think even if people aren't on Twitter, they could search the hashtag Scoped or SCoPEdDebate and actually see some of those threads that you're talking about, and people actually really opening up in a lot of detail about their journey to becoming a therapist, and their worries and concerns about how they would then fit into this kind of framework, really, and what impact it would have on them. So I would encourage people to kind of seek that out, even if you're not on Twitter, you can search for those. Emma, can we come to you?
Okay, I hope everyone can hear me a bit better. I've had a tinkle with my microphone.
I can hear you.
Good. So I fundamentally think the fundamental problem with this framework, I'll put this in context. I've worked previously for the Association of the British Pharmaceutical Industry. So I have put together loads of consultations on policies about governing the pharmaceutical industry in the UK. And actually I contacted BACP when I was still a member last year, offering my expertise. And one of the things that is fundamentally wrong with this framework is actually that they've confused training and practice. It's all well and good, but yes, what they've done is create a table to show the 3 different kind of training routes, but then superimposing that onto practice is a fundamental flaw, because the actual being in actual practice is about competency. So if you've finished your training and you can demonstrate a certain level of competency in doing a role with experience or CPD and stuff like that, you can actually be extremely competent in something at any level. And I'll give an example again from the framework. If we look at 2.4 in the framework, an A person is an ability to draw upon knowledge of common mental health problems and their presentation during assessment and throughout therapy. Fine, everybody knows that at qualification at level 4. But when you go into the C column for 2.4b, it says the ability to understand the language and discourse around diagnosis, psychopathology, and mental disorders. So fundamentally, if I've been on a course about the DSM and understand all the language about diagnoses of various mental health problems, what this is saying is that I would have to have had a level 7 qualification before I can put myself in the C column. Not that I'm at level 4 in my training, but my competence has been assessed because I have a very full and experienced understanding about diagnosis and mental disorders. That's where I think the framework goes wrong. It's that it's missing or mixing training and practice, which are two very different things. If you want to look at people's practice, you have to look at their competencies, assess them against those, because your training doesn't necessarily give you the competence to make you any more senior than anybody else. So that's one of the things I just think is one of the fundamental flaws. And until they have a clear understanding of training versus practice, the framework's never really going to work for anybody.
Okay, thank you. And I think we will talk about a little bit more in detail in the next couple of questions around the different aspects of that framework and moving within the framework. So thank you. Andy, I think if we can come to you next.
Yeah, I suppose just to pick up on that point really, and sort of Rima's point about the journey of being a therapist and how that's a sort of personal sort of, it's not a quantitative thing. It can't be boiled down to how many hours you've done of this or that. You know, it's a holistic thing. It's a sort of growth process, and that's completely missed. And of course, it can't be included in a competence framework using this methodology because it's not, because those kinds of qualities aren't subject to that kind of analysis. So they can't. You almost can't boil that down in the right way for it to appear in this spreadsheet, you know, particularly one that's purporting to be evidence-based and using a particular methodology which claims to be evidence-based. So being a therapist isn't a sort of input-output thing, you know, like you do X, Y, Z, and then this thing comes out the end. You know, it's a sort of unique, relational, and people are at all sorts of different points and stages and phases of their lives on all sorts of levels of training, and I think what Emma was saying about the work and training is sort of conflated in the framework, because initially the argument was that the scope is about mapping training. That's all we're doing. You know, we're just mapping the entry points. But it obviously isn't. It's trying to talk about the role you can be after periods of work. And so we've now got talk of progressing between columns and post-qualification experience, allowing movement up the hierarchy and so on. But again, this is going back to my point earlier about this doing a disservice to the reality of actual therapy practice. If I can sort of come to the politics of it again, there seems to be an attempt by certain groups within UKCP and BPC, the British Psychoanalytic Council specifically, to try and sort of take ownership of depth and complexity. So that the sort of lower level counsellors are sort of seen as offering something, you know, just less in depth, you know, sort of less complicated, less nuanced, you know, less skillful. And sort of weaving through that, we can't ignore the sort of modality issue again there. And this is something I've written about perhaps at length. But person-centered therapy and much of the principles of person-centered therapy is basically erased in scope, and it's certainly in the first version. In the second version, they've made some concessions around language. They sort of softened unconscious to include out of awareness, as if to, you know, sort of to appease the person-centered lobby almost. But and I've no problem with psychoanalytic thinking. I find it fascinating, you know. But to think that there is, in practice, that one approach is inherently deeper or better is a fiction, really. And it says more about the sort of power struggles between theories than the actual reality of practice. So the fact that something which purports to be evidence-based and factual and rooted in what's actually happening. It's so kind of like a part of a certain way of seeing the world, and that it's been a sort of, it's echoed and reproduced all these power dynamics. It's really worrying, because what that tells you is that the idea of it being a sort of factual evidence-based document is actually itself a bit of an illusion. And I mean, well, we could go into where does that bias come from, and how has that ended up playing out, that psychoanalytic work has been kind of found its place at the top of the hierarchy. And you know, you can look at the construction of the or the membership of the ERG, the Expert Reference Group, and how there was no person-centered representation. You know, this has been widely criticised. There was a mild concession made to invite someone who was identified as a person-centered and pluralist. So, but also an extra psychoanalytic member. And I think these things are important. You know, they're not just gripes. You know, they matter, because a genuine kind of person-centered representation would have made all sorts of challenges about the way that the project has evolved, about the way it's speaking about therapeutic work, the way it's trying to boil it down into competencies themselves, which again exclude the very kind of heart and soul stuff, as Rima said earlier on. You know, so I mean, the original question is, how does it represent work and training? Well, at some level, it represents some training, but it doesn't represent what therapy is really about. You know, and again, it's amazing how much work can be done, and then you miss the kind of the center of something, the heart of it, the core of it. It just sort of evaporates in all this kind of technical language, and yeah. So I suppose that's where I am with that bit.
Okay, thank you. Just picking up on that point in terms of the representation of approaches within the SCoPE framework, I know that there has been quite a few different people talking on Twitter about that, but actually not just from the person-centered modality, but from lots of different modalities. So someone existential the other day who was kind of saying, this does not represent what I do as a therapist. And I know that there was some responses on Twitter, which was, well, we need the SCoPE project needs to hear about you. You need to kind of share your views. And I think for me, there's a kind of a problem there, almost, that it is the individual therapist's responsibility to highlight to the SCoPE project where the gaps are and what modalities are not included in that. And I think that is problematic, because you know, not every single therapist is involved in this consultation, is responding. And I think really that it's the other way around. The project should be outlining, if it's mapping it out, should be mapping out what all of us do, and not just what some of us do. Okay, Erin, if you want to answer that question.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm thinking similar to Andy, just about how different modalities are still kind of privileged, and I think it's disempowering both to those that do subscribe to kind of ideas such as unconscious, and it's also disempowering, as Andy described, to those who don't. So if you're a tier B therapist and you want to be tier C, but you don't subscribe to the idea of, you know, if you don't think that mental health placement is relevant to your work, or you don't think that getting a level 7 qualification is relevant to your work, you can't become tier C. You know, your employment prospects are potentially restricted because you're not willing to subscribe to some of the tier C competencies. And conversely, I mean, I was talking on Twitter the other day to somebody who would find themselves in tier A, but qualified as a Gestalt therapist, and the unconscious is inherent in the Gestalt modality, working with dreams and that kind of thing. And I think there's a real question about what would happen to a therapist who was working outside of competency according to SCoPE. I don't think that question has been answered by BACP. So, for example, if there was a complaint made about a therapist who had, you know, been working therapeutically with a rupture, because working therapeutically with a rupture is a tier C competency, I think BACP have a real question to answer about whether there could be a sanction for a tier B therapist working therapeutically with rupture. So I think there's some real questions to answer there about kind of how restrictive is this going to be? Is it going to be a case that tier A and tier B therapists just can't do tier C things? And if not, what is the meaning of it? If we can all use any competencies, what's the meaning of the framework at all? So I think there's some real questions to answer around how this looks in practice and how this could possibly work.
That's great, Erin. Thank you very much. Before we move on to our next kind of question, is there anything anybody wants to kind of come back on or talk about before we move on to another area? I feel like we've covered it. Yeah.
I just want to say I was really moved by what Rima said. Obviously, anyone watching could see that her own thinking about her own personal journey and other people's journeys was kind of getting you emotionally there. And I think that's a real truth. You know, I really felt that. That's a real truth of what's going on at the moment. And that is why it's very, very hard for a lot of people. And I think that really needs to be heard and understood. Thank you, panel. We're going to move on to a question that has been the most popular question. We've already touched on it a little bit. So it is to do with titles. The current scoped document removes the titles used in previous versions and replaces them with columns A, B, and C. So we thought it might be useful to read a little bit about what Scoped says about this. So they say on the document, current differentiation cannot be clearly defined by the titles that are being used by the 3 participating bodies. Titles have therefore been removed so that the focus at this stage is on the evidence rather than the titles, because it demonstrates that all are respected, qualified roles. Each organisation will work individually and collectively to agree titles prior to publication of the final version. So what are the panel's thoughts on this? And we're going to go to Rima first.
Okay, so I think, well, it threw me. The ABC thing really threw me. And like I said at the start, I think it made me think about the titles more. And personally, I don't know how we can feedback on this framework without understanding what titles are going to go with the categories, and to sort of say it'll be added later. I think that's quite a complex process in itself, and I know as members we would still have a say in these titles, because I think that's what's been suggested is there'll be a consultation process when we're talking about titles. I really think that we need to know them from the beginning. Personally, my personal view is that I just think having 3 titles does cause a hierarchy, even if it doesn't intend to, for whatever reason. I think it does create a hierarchy, and I would prefer to have 1 title for us that we can all agree on. And for those on Twitter, we did a bit of a poll to ask clients really what titles do they use in calling us. How do they refer to us? And the majority, when I last looked at the poll, was that they refer to us as therapist. So that doesn't even fit into the 3 titles that are being proposed at this stage. And I think titles are important, and we need to really debate this of what we want as a profession around this, because I think there is a lot of ownership around the psychotherapist title compared to a counsellor title, for example. And I think there is a lot of history around why there is 2 titles anyway in the first place. So my personal point of view is I think we should have 1 title that we should agree on, and I think we should have consultation with all stakeholders around that. And I think that would make it clearer. And I think from being an Indian therapist, and I don't want to speak for all BAME therapists, so I'm speaking for myself in this, but I do think titles are important because that's how we are seen, is through our title. And I think there needs to be more thought on that. Like, for example, what would it feel like to be a Black male therapist in category A, and how would it impact them being called a counsellor compared to a white therapist in category C, if they're to be called psychotherapist? I think there are some implications around this, around titles. So for equality and to sort of, I think there needs to be one title. Personally, that's my personal view, but I do see that there's a lot of attachment with the titles. But I think in order to have one title, we also then need to agree on a set training standards, and they all vary at the moment, so it's not an easy task, really, but that's my view.
Thank you. Okay, so next we're going to go to Emma.
Hi. Again, I think there's been a conflation of two issues. So if we talk about the framework that's been presented, we're back to the issue that titles don't infer competence. So deciding personally, if it was based on this framework and the way it's presented in the 3 columns around the 5 themes, I would totally scrap any titles because they don't mean anything. Titles of counsellors or psychotherapists they're not protected titles. So whether you're in column A, B, or C and call yourself a chief bottle washer doesn't make any difference. There could be one organisation that would advertise for a staff counsellor, whereas another organisation could advertise for a psychotherapist, depending on what their HR decide to call it, and it could be an identical job description. So that's where I think it's conflated, that as long as we keep on arguing about which column is named what and which title it infers a person to work under, depending on which column they're under, it doesn't make any sense because titles do not infer competency. I see this as a competency framework that even if you removed all 3 columns and just said you could present evidence on how you meet each of these competencies and get assessed by your supervisor every 6 months or annually, similar to the way doctors get appraised and revalidated, there isn't any difference. The same way a junior registrar gets revalidated is exactly the same process that a consultant gets revalidated. They're put under the same level of scrutiny because there's no difference in their titles. It's about competency to do your job. And in private practice, it wouldn't make any difference anyway. So that's my view.
Thank you very much, Emma. Okay, let's go to Andy now.
It's really hard not to be a bit cynical about this for me. The removal of the titles and then for them to be planned to be reinstated in some form. Because we can't just forget that they were there. So, and I think Rima might have said earlier that, it almost made her think about them more. And I can see why they would want us to not really think about it too much, like the title element, because the title issue, as sort of Emma was saying, does sort of it highlights a flaw in the whole project, really, of trying to sort of separate us into columns and based on competence and training and so on. I think it's really important to remember. I mean, this is one of my kind of pet stories, so people have heard it before. Forgive me, but the reason we use counselling counsellor as titles is because Carl Rogers in the 1950s used that switch to counsellor because in the counselling centre he was working in and ran, in the state at the time, you had to be a medical doctor, medically qualified to practice psychotherapy. So in a way, it was quite a sort of mischievous, almost kind of political kind of thing to carry on doing their work, which the perceived, and his book titles tell you that Corrigan saw it as psychotherapy. But so the history tells us that these words aren't, they're not just descriptors of actual differences. That there's a kind of political history to them, which has evolved over time and appeals to people in different ways. And there's another thing which I wrote about in a previous SCoPEd piece, which is that person-centered therapy was very nearly found its sort of professional home within UKCP, the psychotherapy organisation. But it was just small issues, which meant that leading practitioners at the time, when UKCP and BACP, or BAC as it was then, was developing, meant that those leading person-centered practitioners kind of decided to sort of throw their lot in with BACP. So what may look quite clear now of that there's psychotherapists and counsellors was historically not clear at all. It was deeply charged with a kind of political reasoning and motivations and agendas, and I mean that sort of that is kind of sustained and well understood in the person-centered approach, where you see no differentiation between those two terms. They're used interchangeably. Many person-centered therapists train on counselling and psychotherapy trainings, some of which don't, it would seem, meet the column C psychotherapist competencies. So yeah, it's a complicated history, but I think it's quite important to really get your head around what the sort of other meanings of these terms, if that makes sense. But what that tells us is that SCoPEd isn't mapping what's there, it's imposing something. It's sort of overlaying a certain kind of appearance onto something. And then you can start to ask, well, why is it doing that? And what's the motivation for that? Which is perhaps a different question. But it's not mapping what's there. It's trying to organise things in a particular way. I mean, I think it was Dennis Postal who said that about SCoPEd, that it was like someone looking at a kind of landscape filled with trees and meadows and clearings and dark forests and hills and mountains, and sort of thinking, well, that's a bit chaotic. I think we should organise this more. We need to kind of celebrate the diversity in our approach, in our field, in the work, and celebrate the kind of richness of that, and find a way of articulating that. We don't have to throw our lot in with healthcare, and medical practice to try and articulate the value of what we do. If we do that, we lose something. Well, arguably, going back to the heart metaphor, we lose the heart of what we're doing. And I think the profession's dangerously far down that road, and SCoPEd's a sort of big example of that. So yeah, I mean, the title issue is, on one level, it's like, oh, here we are again, having this conversation about titles and the power struggle between them. But it's also a really crucial one, and it's really it's a real window into what's actually happening.
Thanks a lot, Andy. It's always fascinating to hear some history. I knew that your former point, I didn't know your latter point, so I've learned something. Yeah, and I guess with history, there may be an argument for moving on and, moving away from things that have happened in the past or whatever, but also I think history is very important in terms of learning and really being able to look at everything in the context of history. So I hope viewers found that useful. Let's go to Erin next.
I guess my first feeling response to them taking the titles out temporarily was that I found it quite comical. So I thought it was quite funny, really, to kind of, oh, we're going to take them out so you can't see them, and then we're going to put them back in. I just found it amusing. And then I guess a lot of therapists have talked about finding it quite insulting, and I can really understand how people are feeling that way about it. I guess my major concern, reflecting on it, is that I'm concerned about people missing that the titles are going to be put back in. I didn't see this initially. It was pointed out to me by somebody that the titles are going back in. And my concern is that maybe not everybody will see that the titles are going back in. And so when the consultations with members are being done, perhaps people will be, I mean, I actually did see people posting, oh, isn't it good they've taken the titles out? Where, you know, with no kind of appreciation, like not having seen the fact that they're going to go back in. So my concern is that people are going to be filling out the consultation without realising that the titles are going to be going back in. Unknown titles are going to be going back in at a later stage, and we still don't know the process for how those titles are going to be decided. So that's my major concern.
Okay, thanks a lot, Erin. And yeah, I mean, again, that's a really useful kind of learning point, hopefully, for people to hear that that's what the deal is with the titles. Let's move finally on to Jay.
Hi there. I'm sort of waiting for the screen to get bigger, which it isn't. Anyway, I think yeah. I mean, my view is basically, I think psychotherapists are going to be loath to change their title, yeah, and loath to think that anyone else can claim it. And like I said before, I think if you're a UKCP member, that's absolutely fair, you know. If you want to think that psychotherapy is better and or different, go for it. But I don't think the BACP, because they're meant to represent both counsellors and psychotherapists, should tolerate that view. Back in 2009, the BACP actually had a policy that they didn't recognise a difference between counselling and psychotherapy, and I'm very confused as to when they changed that or where they changed that. But certainly, you know, back last time of statutory regulation, they had a view that counselling and psychotherapy were the same. In my view, that title would have to go in terms of the SCoPE project for there to be any chance of any consensus. But I don't think you can predict that would happen. My own views, I'm not so bothered by title as long as different levels, everyone can claim the badges, as it were. So say, for instance, you, through pre-qualification and post-qualification experience, for instance, became very familiar with, say, hearing voices. Now, and working with people who hear voices. Now, I think it doesn't really matter whether you're a counsellor or a psychotherapist, but you both should be able to claim the badge. And that's my view. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks a lot, Ray. Well, I mean, some really, really interesting answers there. I don't know, does anyone have anything to say, or have we kind of covered everything?
I guess the one point that I didn't make was that I did a BACP accredited counselling and psychotherapy diploma, which was 100 client hours. It was a postgraduate diploma, but I think BACP are going to really have to think about whether they are going to be accrediting trainings with the psychotherapy title attached to them if they're saying that there is this difference.
Yeah, and I think hopefully we're going to think a bit more about that actually in the next question. Is that right, Peter?
Yeah, that's right. Just before we move on to that, I just wanted to highlight that we're on about nearly 25 past 3, and we have got about 5 more questions to go through. So, we'll just wanted to highlight that to everybody. It might be that we run a little bit over the 4 o'clock. So the next question is sticking with the idea of these categories or these columns that have been put into the SCoPE's documentation. We just wanted to know, what do panel members think about these columns or these titles as a suggested pathway as a means to career progression? Because there is discussion in this SCoPE document about being able to move, I was going to say between categories, but presumably people would only want to move from up A towards C rather than the other way around. So yeah, what do people think about that as a potential career progression? Emma, if we could go to you first.
I'll keep it short because it more or less goes with what I said before, that I think it's a bit of a red herring, because career progression within an organisation as an employee would be about your experience unless certain qualifications become mandated within that organisation. And then in private practice, again, where would you be progressing to, and how would it change your clients that you can work with, unless that becomes mandated between the 3 columns? So again, that's where I think there's this conflation between training routes and what you would practice and your competence around that.
Okay, thank you. And I think it's important to note that this kind of does feel like maybe a change in terminology in terms of this version of the SCoPEd project compared to the first iteration that was released. Okay, Andy, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I suppose it's not just a change in terminology, is it? There's it shows the shift in there's almost sort of an admittance that it's not the project isn't mapping, it's trying to redefine the field in a way, and it's tried to answer a lot of queries about where would I fit if I can do this and this, but I'm deemed at this level because of this part of my training or whatever. Yeah, so it just really highlights that hole in it again, I suppose. And it does this sort of movement thing between the, you know, from A to C, does sort of suggest a kind of linear progression from sort of basic therapists to intermediate therapists and then advanced therapists, which I'm not sure really is the reality of practice, which to me, practice seems not about a kind of forward momentum, but a kind of a broadening out. You know, it's a kind of deepening, which I don't think this captures through. And I found the case studies sort of baffling in a way of where you could be and what you could do, because it created this possibility that there will be ways for BAC. I mean, like myself, because I'm not accredited. I never have been. I've chosen to do other CPD activities, and it's just something that's never come my way. I've not seen it as important. I was fortunate enough to have paid work without it, which I'm aware can be really difficult. But yeah, it's kind of like, where do I sit? You know, and then there seems to be this kind of real effort to sort of try and answer all these queries. Well, you could be here, you could be here, but how will you check that? And then the answer is, well, we haven't quite decided yet, but there's going to be things we're going to put in place to assess whether you got to this level or that level. But we don't know quite what they are yet, but we want you to approve this iteration and move the project forward, or get it done, in the words of the chair of the Psychoanalytic Council. So I just think that's, for one thing, is just the principle of sort of voting on something. Well, I know we're not voting, but like being asked to comment on something where we don't really know what's going to happen, and what how these gaps are going to be filled. But the gaps themselves just demonstrate what feels quite an absurd way of kind of describing the field, which is actually more complex than that. I mean, I'll leave it there because I know we're short of time.
No, that's great. There's some really important points there. Thank you. Erin, we'll move on to you.
There's a direct contradiction between what it says in the SCoPE framework and what it says in the case studies. If anybody hasn't seen the case studies, if you go to the BACP website, if you go to the SCoPEd page where you can download the framework, sort of, I think it's bottom right hand corner, there's a link to the case studies, so you can see example A, I'm such and such, and if I do this, I'll get to be that. So in the SCoPE framework, for client hours to be in different columns, for column B, it says 450 client hours, including hours gained after core training. And in column C, it says 450 hours minimum during training. So it makes a clear distinction between column B and column C, that column B can include post-qualification hours and column C can't. Yet the case studies seem to suggest that if you do an additional top-up course, which includes a mental health placement or familiarisation, that you can in fact move into column C from column B, presumably without the 450 minimum hours during core training. And that's a direct contradiction that I think really needs to be addressed. again, like Andy was saying, I think it's really concerning that the BACP doesn't have mechanisms for recognising movement between B and C. So it doesn't have mechanisms for recognising these top-up courses. It also hasn't said where these top-up courses are going to come from, who's going to pay from them, how counsellors working in full-time private practice or full-time employment are going to find time to do mental health placements. And it also says that the BACP's main mechanism for movement between A and B is currently accreditation, but we would need to find other mechanisms for members who have chosen not to do accreditation. They've also said that these additional mechanisms wouldn't have a cost attached to them, which throws a question open as to what's the point of accreditation if you don't have to pay for this other mechanism that they're going to create in future. There's a lot of confusion, there's direct contradictions, and there's no clarity.
Okay, thank you. There was a lot of questions from therapists around this particular issue, and particularly there was some therapists I know who'd communicated with BACP who were asking for clarity around what would happen around these mechanisms in terms of moving up the tiers, if you like. And I know that there was some people who got fed back that the decision would be made after the framework was introduced, and I think that really raised a lot of people's anxieties around, you know, agreeing to something before they knew actually how it was going to operate and what was going to happen in that. Okay, Jay, if we could come to you.
I've got nothing in principle against people being able to gain, as I sort of said before, you know, gain badges of various kinds post-qualification. But I think once you're qualified, you're qualified. And I think, as Rima was saying earlier, that's like really the baseline. And that's what this kind of thing challenges, and what, you know, sort of accreditation and so forth is maybe kind of challenged, and this sort of volunteering culture and everything like that. You know, I think the message needs to be that once someone's qualified as a therapist, they're qualified. And if they want to gain additional badges, fine. But the main thing is that once you're qualified, you are qualified. And they're also in that any additional trainings or continuing professional development, or indeed getting your own therapy, needs to be count fully. It shouldn't just be sort of certain BACP courses or whatever that count. And I think really it all should all be under a generic title, as again I think Emma was saying, you know, maybe like psychological therapist or something. But I know that a lot of people would maybe not want to be called a psychological therapist, and there'd probably be arguments about what that generic title would be. And that's what I think.
Okay, thank you. I think there'd be lots of discussions about what that title would be. Rima, can we come to you?
Yeah, I think the panel's pretty much covered it. I think, you know, if we're stepping away from this framework and thinking about one title, and, you know, you're qualified, that means you're qualified. So anything extra you do, you're doing sort of as from your choice, really. And as Jay was saying, sort of carrying on adding them badges, that's fine. And I think being in this profession, you're going to be in lifelong learning, because we'll never get to the point of knowing the human mind and behavior and emotions and everything that goes with it. So I think we're signing up to lifelong learning anyway. But I think my main issue with this is I think there needs to be more clarity around what happens to existing trainees and therapists, because we've paid for our training and we've signed up for what we wanted to sign up for. So I think if we're being asked to do anything extra, is that fair? You know, is that fair? I'm not sure it is. And I think that needs to be debated a lot more. So within this project, I think there needs to be a lot more voices heard about what will happen to existing therapists, and also new pathways for the new people coming into the profession.
Okay. Thank you, Rima. I'm sure the panel can see, but we've had so many comments throughout the discussion today. One of them that I just wanted to pick up on and just kind of throw it out there really was Fiona had identified, and she says, I'm paraphrasing, competency frameworks are used for recruitment, appraisals and promotion. Membership bodies are not employers. Any employers have their own competency framework, so why would membership bodies be trying to create their own? And I just thought that was an interesting point. Has any of the panel got any comments on that or anything else from that question before we move on?
I have a comment around it. I totally get what Fiona's saying, because obviously if you were an employed therapist within an organisation, you would be appraised against competencies and various things like that. But because of the discussions we're constantly having about, you know, counsellor versus psychotherapy and stuff, where I would be in support of a competency framework that all membership bodies use would be because of the disparity in training. That, you know, somebody trained at level 4 or at level 5, depending on what college they go to, would have been taught totally different things. So that's where, if membership bodies have this kind of competency framework that everybody could work to, again, I disagree with the columns. I think it could be much wider than that everybody could be assessed against whichever competency they choose to evidence. But then that would then bring some consistency amongst the profession, because if we're all assessed against the same set of competencies and have all achieved the same competencies, that then does give some level playing field in which you can get employed or whatever and say these are the competencies I've achieved as a professional.
So for you, Emma, it'd almost be like a generic set of competencies that we were all kind of adhering to, and that was set out that we were all required to do, rather than the current scope iteration, which is like a tiered approach to competencies of people can do.
Funnily enough, I would take this framework and just make it would just be all of them listed, and you can have your supervisor or a representative from the membership body. You can produce evidence and say, oh, I presented at so-and-so conference and write, 200 words about it or something. Or, I read this research paper or wrote a research paper and stuff like that. And then you get assessed against that competency and deemed that you've achieved it. So then you don't have to be in column C. Everybody has an opportunity in the progression of their career over years to be able to be assessed against competencies they choose to.
Which opens it up also beyond the idea of this core training or whatever. Actually, it's all the different things we do as therapists and different avenues where we could evidence that.
Yeah. And it allows progression within the field, in the sense of if something crops up in a few years' time that actually all therapists need to be competent, we don't know what's going to happen in society or whatever around a particular area, then everybody has the opportunity to achieve that competence and work towards it and evidence it, and you get picked off it, you've done it.
I think that would really help the employer as well, to actually have some foundation, and so it not be thrown on them as an employer, having to make up their own competency framework. So I think that could be challenged, which is fine for it to be challenged, but I don't think therefore there'll be consistency across the board. So I like the idea of the professional body having a framework, but something that's really inclusive and equal across the board.
Yeah, because you don't all have to be assessed against the same thing. You can pick and choose depending on your own CPD and stuff like that. But it's still evidence that there's a broad brush of everybody being on the same level.
And I think the difficulty with that is obviously going to be making sure that everybody is happy with how those competencies are worded and what is included within them. And obviously, we were talking about earlier, different modalities saying, actually, you're not including me in that. How all of a sudden those group of people are excluded because it's not something they do within their approach. But
it's relatively simple to do if some thought goes into it as well. So I've done it before.
This has actually been really interesting, this question, because Erin, by the way, I think you explained that really, really well. I'm just thinking of all the people here today as well, and the different confusions. like Andy, I'm a long-term therapist. I'm not accredited through choice. There's a reason for that. So I have anxieties about, well, what does that mean now? And then, you know, Erin gave an example there of being a master's level student, qualified, and wondering about the difference between the hours that they ask for, and then in column C, and the fact that you've actually got a level 7 qualification. In fact, I think probably all of us are educated to a certain level. I think there's probably at least one doctor here who might be appearing on column A, at least maybe. So there seems to be, that in this kind of, I think there's kind of agreement here that this idea of core training just being it seems to be in some ways problematic and very, very confusing. So maybe looking at, you know, what else, whether it's even pre-therapy stuff or experience in therapy, and how that can be looked at.
Yeah.
Okay. Should we move on?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. So this is a question put to us by the TherapistsConnect community, and it's to do with a very important point. What benefits do you think the SCoPE project will have for clients? So what benefits do you think it will have for clients? And if you don't think it will have a benefit, is there anything else you think needs to happen or to be taken into consideration when thinking about clients as stakeholders? So let's go to Emma. Let's go back to Emma first.
I found this question a bit hard because I pondered it for a while, because I can't actually see how the framework as it stands benefits clients, besides the fact that a qualified therapist is a qualified therapist. And who's to say that, you know, because the whole experience of a client with a therapist is in the room, it's all about the relationship the client has with their therapist. So who's to say that a level 7 column C therapist is any better than than a level A therapist or level 4 qualified therapist? So it's really hard to see how this will benefit clients, besides sticking to the point that a qualified therapist is a qualified therapist.
Okay, thank you. Let's go to Andy next.
Yeah, I find this tough as well. I suppose because I'm not sure how interested clients really are in this sort of stuff, and how much it really impacts them. You know, I mean, I think it impacts them potentially indirectly, but it's. I mean, it could be detrimental in the sense that it encourages this kind of mindset of clients, rather than trusting their own kind of interpersonal judgment and authentic experience of their therapist or prospective therapist, to sort of defer to this kind of more structured, hierarchical kind of system, external system, you know, which is like sort of, in person-centered terms, like an external locus of evaluation, you know, to sort of, how do I judge this thing? Or this kind of this wordy document, which is kind of backed by these acronymed membership bodies, and you know, so I mean, I just think it takes us a little bit in the wrong direction in that respect. And I mean, it's not really about clients, the project, and it's sort of profession centered, and the benefits to clients are just sort of assumed to be the side effect of sort of positive side effects of greater legitimacy or status or something. So, which for me is full of holes as an argument. And there's no real client voice in the project, obviously, at all. So, which is another sort of hole.
Absolutely. Okay. Thank you, Andy. Let's go to Erin.
So to me, this is the question. This is the whole reason why I'm here, and the whole reason why it feels so important to me to campaign about SCoPE in the way that I have. I don't believe this is a project with clients in mind. And I think this is really clearly illustrated by the fact there was no consultation with clients. we've heard a lot about stakeholders. Clients are the stakeholder, and there has been no consultation with clients unless there's been extra consultation, because we haven't actually been told who the stakeholders are this time around that they've apparently consulted with. So, but as far as I'm aware, there's no consultation with clients. I engage with clients on Twitter. I am a client, and I also engage with clients on Twitter. And one thing that clients on Twitter, at least, have expressed around SCoPE is that actually they would like greater clarity about what we do. So if SCoPE did that, I'd be saying, well, that seems like a good thing for if, you know, clients want sort of a better idea about what we do. But I actually don't think it offers this, and I think it actively misleads anybody who reads it about the nature of our profession, because I think it's really inaccurate. What I think that they could have done to help clients have greater clarity about what the profession is, they could have demystified the PSA, because I don't think enough is out there about the PSA, and I don't think enough education is out there about what the PSA is and the function that it forms. So I think it would have been really helpful for clients if SCoPED or whatever project had been about kind of really explaining what a PSA accredited body is and how you could kind of check your therapist against the PSA accredited register. The other thing that I think they could have done is explain the modalities, not in a way that ranks them and says that some are superior than others, but just in a way that sort of really clearly explains how different therapists work with different clients, etc. And for me, the other way in which SCoPED is really damaging is that, and I think we're going to come on to discuss that in greater detail later, but I think SCoPED, the way it's structured, will have a negative impact on diversity and equality of access to the profession for trainees. And I think this will have a knock-on effect in terms of representation. And I think this will have a detrimental effect to the diverse population of clients.
Thank you. And yes, we are going to have a question on that very, very important subject. So let's go to Jay next.
I don't really know how much attention clients give to membership bodies at all, except maybe through Google and trying to find a therapist, you know, in the first place. For instance, I had an acquaintance who did some research about how clients choose their therapists. I don't think that was one of the factors. One of the main factors was on postcode. People like to choose the therapist who actually lives nearest to them. So I don't know how important these membership bodies are to clients. I think it's all about therapists, as someone else said. And it's also, to my mind, about professional closure. Psychotherapists wanting to close off what belongs to them and leave something over for counsellors. So to me, it's all about that. And in terms of what I think needs to happen for clients, I think they need real choice and the ability to actually get what they want and not what we say they need. And like, if you look at the NHS IACT project, it's happening in reverse. There's actually less choice in terms of what kind of therapist you're going to see than there was even 20 years ago. So to me, it's backwards. It's not gone forwards at all. So that's my thought on what needs to happen for clients.
Okay, thanks a lot, Jay. Where are we going now? Rima.
I agree with the panel, and I think clients have to be central to this. And I really want to see the feedback of what they would make of this. Yes, I do agree that on some level, clients are not going to be that bothered about maybe some of the ins and outs, but I think they put a trust in us and the profession that we've already done X, Y, and Z in terms of professional checks and qualifications, and they put that trust in that they're going to get met, you know, by someone that's going to actually help. So I think their voice is central to this, and we need to know what they make of this. for me, the current model is still confusing, with having 3 titles and 3 entry points, and how they make a decision on category A versus a category C when they're coming for example, bereavement counselling. You know, if we just bring it down to a sort of everyday level of when we're getting inquiries for relationship issues, for stress, for anxiety, and how are they going to navigate who's the right fit for them if we've got these 3 categories. So I don't think it helps at this stage. But I think there is a lot more work that needs to be done about consulting with clients and clarifying things. So I'm hoping this feedback can go back really, and that it can be taken on board.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Rima. And I think that also touches on the point that, of course, it may be different depending on what setting you're working in. You and I know private practice, like you say, if you have someone looking for bereavement counselling, there's perhaps going to be certain things on their mind and certain things not on their mind, and that may be different to therapists working in other settings. So, all right. So, Peter, we've got an interesting question next. Do you want to move on?
I just wanted to make a quick point there in terms of talking about stakeholders and clients as stakeholders, really. I think Erin picked up on this point before. In the methodology documentation, it talks about the SCoPE project contacting 483 stakeholders for their views on the SCoPEd project, and only 86 of those stakeholders replied. I do think it's a really important question as to who are those stakeholders, who are those people who were asked to comment on the project, and why was only 86 of them responded, and whether there were any client groups or anything like that as part of that part of the project. And I just think for me that's an unanswered question, and I know there's other people been asking that question as well. So I just wanted to highlight that before we move on to the next question. Okay, so the next question is quite interesting because I don't think this is something that is particularly discussed really in the SCoPE documentation, but I do think it is quite an important question. What do panel members think about what impact do they think panel members think the SCoPE project will have on supervision within the profession? And Andy, we're coming to you first.
I think initially it would almost be irrelevant, you know, when it comes in, because people sort of tend to go on just working as they have. But there's a sort of big but in there, which is that I mean, and part of my reasoning for saying, by the way, that it's not that it'll just sort of sit there and be irrelevant. It's because I've been in sectors. I worked in counselling in colleges and universities for a long time, and there was a competence framework introduced there, which has similar degrees of sort of controversy around it. And what seemed to happen was it just kind of sort of disappears. It just sort of sits on everyone's hard drive, and that's it. You know, but it does have an effect, you know, and it sort of seeps in. And potentially it sort of seeps into our way of being as therapists, but in this case supervisors, and it will create, you know, all the questions we've been addressing today will create queries for supervisors about who should be doing what kind of work and with whom, and working with what kind of material, and working at what depth. And if my supervisee is in column A and they're discussing working with the unconscious, what does that mean? And so we'll create these kind of questions. And I mean, I would like to think it's down to supervisors to work with those autonomously and to sort of challenge these things structurally with their organisations when it creates difficulties. But I don't see it having a very positive effect. I can't see what the benefit would be from the project for supervision. Yeah, so it just provides it's just another kind of external thing to try and work out where you are in relation to, I suppose, as a supervisor. But I'm sure there'll be other questions which will come of it, though.
Okay, thank you, Andy. If we come to Erin next.
I think you and I, Peter, were talking before about what the potential implications are for a Tier B supervisor and a Tier C supervisee, and it's mind-boggling really how that would work and what that would feel like just in the relationship as well. I think the other thing that really came to mind when I considered this question was my own experiences of supervision. I go to supervision sometimes, occasionally with a client, and I'll say, look, I'm not sure that I'm the right therapist for this client because I maybe don't have the right experience. I'm thinking maybe I need to refer them to a different kind of organisation or something that will be able to give them more appropriate support. And my supervisor and I will have a collaborative discussion about this. And between us, we will make a professional judgment on whether I'm best placed to continue work with this client. If the client wants to work with me, we'll make a professional judgment, and sometimes that'll lead to me referring a client on, and sometimes that'll lead to me working with a client. But that's a professional judgment, and in my supervision, that's always been collaborative. I imagine there are occasions where a supervisor has to kind of make a more sort of authoritative kind of, no, you really must refer this client. I'm sure that's quite rare, but I imagine it does happen. But that is based on the supervisor's judgment. And I'm concerned and wondering whether a sort of competency framework like this supersedes the supervisor's judgment. So, for example, a client with enduring mental health conditions, that's a Tier C competency. So what are the implications for a supervisor who, discusses with a Tier B therapist, well, actually, I think you can work with this client. Are there any implications there for the supervisor? Again, these are just questions that haven't been explored and answered. And especially, I think, when it comes to really, really badly misplaced competencies, such as working therapeutically with rupture, are supervisors to say to a supervisee who's working therapeutically with rupture, I'm afraid you can't do that because it's a Tier C competency. Are supervisors supposed to police this? How's that going to work? And I really don't think any sort of explanation has been given to how that might work in practice.
Okay, thank you. And I think you're right there to highlight some really important unanswered questions and potentially intended or unintended consequences of that framework on supervision. Jay, if we could come to you next.
I'd like to echo the last bit of just what Erin said, that definitely supervisors should be, always have been, and I hope they remain as consultants for therapists, and they should never be police. And I think that, to me, the whole sort of counselling profession, especially like BSP, is kind of quite defensive. It's almost like in TA terms, we're not okay. Which was sort of notoriously with that secret shopper idea, which, where BACP in one of their moments of clarity thought it might be a good idea to send kind of pretend clients to therapists to see how they do, and I really don't want that to be a supervisor's role where they're police people. They should be consultants. That's what I think.
Thank you. Rima?
I think we need choice over our supervisors, and the supervisory relationship is at the core of that relationship. It's such an important relationship, and some of the supervisors I've had, they've not matched my modality and qualifications and experience, and that's why I have sought them out. And I think that's really important for us to have to make our own decision as therapists on which supervisor feels right for us. And I think some courses are already, stipulate that you can only see a supervisor within that modality that the trainee's training in, which I do understand why. However, I think with this framework being introduced, there's a potential of supervisors are either being told to sort of police therapists in a different way using this competency framework, or another limitation. So, you know, if supervisors can only see A category therapists because they're in an A category and B category and all the rest of it. So it potentially has huge implications. But I guess the key thing here is it's completely missing from the framework. So that there needs to be a lot more thought to be added on, I think.
Okay. Thank you. And I think it's really important to acknowledge there that it is completely missing from the framework. There isn't really any mention of that at all. Last but not least, Emma.
I'll just say in the interest of time, actually, I don't have anything to add because what the previous four said were more or less what I was going to say as well. Okay,
no problem. Thank you very much. I know we've got a really important question kind of coming up next. So has anyone just got any final comments on that area before we move on? No. Okay, Kaz, I think it's over to you for our last kind of big question.
I just wanted to also say, because it's 4 o'clock, if anyone has to leave us now, then this is being recorded. So, you know, if you want to come back tomorrow and kind of watch the bits that you're missing, please feel free to. So, yeah, really important question here. So, panel, do you think that the SCoPE document represents diversity and equality with respect and inclusion for different cultural backgrounds, therapists and trainees? We're going to come to Erin first.
Okay, so this is another really important question for me. I think that the SCoPE framework privileges some of the more expensive and exclusive courses, and I think that that is going to disproportionately impact on people from marginalised groups. Similarly, according to the case studies, moving between Tier A and Tier B requires 450 hours client work, and as Rima pointed out, that's likely to be unpaid in most cases at the moment. Organisational work is largely unpaid, unfortunately, in this profession. Movement between, especially for unaccredited therapists, and similarly, movement between B and C involves an additional top-up course, including a mental health placement. Obviously, that is another matter of expense and time. I imagine that those courses aren't going to be free. And again, this is going to impact on marginalised groups. The competency, ability to communicate about the harm caused by discriminatory practices is put in Tier C. So the implication is there that people in Tier A and B can't communicate about the harm caused by discriminatory practices, whereas I would argue that the way SCoPE is structured actually leaves therapists in Tier A and B more at risk of discriminatory practices. I think that a lot of the theory in the framework privileges Western-centric, white-centric values. No attention is given to diverse, culturally focused therapies. And I think it's really important to say, as somebody that is a researcher on harm in therapy, I write a lot about harm in therapy. People from marginalised groups report proportionally much higher rates of harm in therapy than the general client population. So we already have an issue with meeting the needs of clients from different backgrounds. And in my view, SCoPE really demonstrates a part of why that is, because I think it really has some negative implications for providing a diverse workforce for a diverse client population.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Erin. Okay, Jay.
Yeah, you know, a lot of what Erin said. Obviously, the more training you need and the more placements you need before you can actually get a job or work privately has class implications. And I think that's always been a problem in therapy. And the SCoPE sort of hierarchy thing so far doesn't seem to make that any better. That's what I think.
Yeah, thank you, Jay. Okay, let's move on to Rima.
I think think we could use the opportunity really here to kind of really allow the current project to include a whole research on this, to be honest, because we haven't got diverse representation. There's huge barriers to entering the profession if you're disabled, if you're working class, race, you know, all of the isms. It puts a lot of barriers up into sort of accessing the profession already. I know from the top of my head, when we've just done the BACP have just done a members survey, and I think just under 7,000 respondents there was to the survey, and from that only 3.1% were Black therapists and 2.5% were mixed race, 2.1 were Indian therapists, and I think it was 1.9 that were ethnic minority. So we've already got a problem to solve, and the Black Lives Matter movement I'm hoping has really shone a light to all the professional bodies that a lot more needs to happen. So this isn't going to be easily solved within this project, but I think this could be used as a way to actually start thinking about the barriers that currently exist and what could be done. One of the things that really helped me, coming from a working class background, was that my training course allowed for it to be part-time and that there was a payment plan. And I really hope that training institutes always offer something like that as an option, including some sort of bursaries and funding. So there's so much more that needs to happen to make the therapy profession accessible, I think. So do I think that the current framework is going to help? No, I don't, to be honest. But I think if a lot changes with the framework, then yes.
Thanks a lot, Rima. Okay, let's move on to Emma.
I think, again, it's reflecting what others have said. The framework as it currently stands with the 3 columns for practice to set up an elitist hierarchy that would be very hard to be accessible to anybody that is in any way of marginalised background to be able to even afford to train. So, yeah, I don't think SCoPE represents any form of diversity, equality, or equity for people at all.
Okay, thank you, Emma, and finally, Andy.
Yeah, I mean, I just support what everyone else has said, and it makes me think about my own privileges as a young white man being able to, who went to away to train as a counsellor, and had enough backing economically to be able to do that, and how that sort of feeds into what we're all saying really about the way that these kind of systems can potentially restrict diversity, which is just inherently a bad thing for the field. And just one quick point really is that the hierarchical structure, which I think sort of similar to Emma's point, the hierarchical structure of the SCoPE system actually emulates the power dynamics of structural inequality, and also carries that illusion of meritocracy. You know, that we can just, well, if you just work hard, you know, and do the extra training, then you'll find your way to the top. And I think that in itself is potentially very damaging.
Okay, thanks a lot, panel. Is there anything to add? Peter, did you have anything to add there? It seems like the panel is, I don't know, a little bit in agreement there, I suppose.
No, I didn't have anything to add.
I would just add, you know, my point that I did in my blog, you know, about which I'd like to actually write more about one day, is about, you know, the whole counselling therapy industry being a bit of a pyramid scheme, and in that sense, it's all right for the people who can afford to sort of just throw a lot of money at something and never get a return, but obviously most people aren't in that position.
Yeah, thank you, Jay. Yeah, we all know as therapists how important this area is, and obviously the bodies themselves well, I can speak for the BACP. I think if you do a BACP accredited course, you have to write an essay on culture. So it is really at the heart of well, I'll just talk about the BACP as a membership body. So let's hope maybe some of these concerns have been heard today. Peter.
I'd just like to say that my BACP accredited course didn't involve an essay on diversity. It involved a lecture on diversity, but it didn't involve an essay.
Interesting. Okay, that's really interesting. So I'm giving false information there. I don't know whether that was ever the case. That was my understanding. So I don't know whether that rule has changed somewhere along the line. I'm not sure, but thank you, Erin, for adding that in. Okay, Peter.
Okay, so we've kind of run over by 10 minutes, but we're just coming to the close now. This is our last question. And we just thought, I won't zoom in on anybody, I'll just kind of leave the panel open as we do this. Just in maybe a sentence or two, what panel members now think should happen to the SCoPE project? Okay, Jay, if we could come to you first.
In sum, basically, instead of a top-down approach, I think there should be a bottom-up approach with members feeding ideas up. And I think it's fine to talk about standards, but in my view, not with reference to titles. As I've sort of said before, I think thinking about how to badge practitioners, yeah, fine, but by actual experience, pre and post qualification experience, and actual training and actual specialisms learned along the way. I'd just like to quote Polkinghorne. I haven't quoted anybody, but he talked way back in 1992 about two types of psychology, and the first psychology is the academic, and the second psychology is about practice. And he said therapists use previously effective actions as a guide for their future actions. Their clinical experiences are the source of their knowledge. And that, to me, is where I come from in relation to SCoPE. I think it's experience of practitioners that's far more important than trainings or personal therapy or anything. Just experience, learning from each and every client. That's my view.
Okay, thank you. Rima?
I think what I said at the start is I'm in a reflective place, and I think it's important that we're all filtering in to feeding back about the project and what we're wanting. I'm wanting more clarification and one title, possibly. I don't know if the full implications of that, but one title and not a hierarchy system really. And but welcome clarity and welcome the aims of the project really. I'm not pro scrapping the whole thing, but I am pro sort of seeing this as a starting point and developing as we go along with a lot of our voices being heard within that.
Okay, thank you. Emma?
Well, the flippant thing would be to say to scrap it entirely. But I suppose for me, I'm not a member of any of these organisations, so I kind of feel quite impotent in being able to influence or put forward any alternatives. But I think, well, I have actually mocked up an alternative, but I think what needs to happen is much more in-depth consultation and not just go on the basis of the next iteration would be the final thing, but actually being able to, for these organisations to be open to the fact that maybe this framework isn't going to work and actually look at different models that could work.
I think that's really important. I mean, kind of not even feeling you're actually having a voice within that framework right now, you know. I think it definitely needs to be widened out to have more views. Andy, your view?
I don't suppose it'd be a surprise to anyone that I say that I don't really support it. But I mean, I think the membership body, I mean, this is kind of what they do, you know. This is so it's not surprising that they're doing it. But I think they should take a step back and one thing, stop trying to control the narrative around it and really celebrate the fact that people have different views on it, you know, and not be defensive about that, you know, just to say, well, this is you know, I mean, it's great really that we can be here and the way this allows us to sort of burrow down into what therapy actually is and what it really means to people, you know, through this kind of window of scope, for all its flaws. There's a sort of value in it for that in a strange way. But it needs to be a listening. I mean, the sort of corporate consultation exercise is just no good, you know, because it doesn't really change anything, and it doesn't. BACP and the others need to be able to celebrate and embrace the fact that people like some of the panelists here, or all of us in different ways, have these serious, substantive concerns about the project. You know, that's not something to be defensive about or prickly about. It's something to sort of welcome, I would have thought, you know, the sort of diversity of thought. And somehow therapy's got to grapple with the fact that people are working within the field, but work in very, very different ways, and see right down to what it means to be a person in the world very, very differently. And somehow it has to kind of encapsulate all this, you know. And it seems to have wanted to escape that complexity, to sort of iron it out and sort of deny it by imposing a kind of much more sort of reductionist structure, which I don't really think benefits the people who would, you know, support it as a project. So yeah, I just think they need to sort of find a way to, going back to what I said at the beginning, really, to sort of this special thing that we do, to protect it, to take it forward, and not to be frightened of difference, you know, of thought or any other differences, rather than trying to force this kind of complex ecology, which we all sort of occupy different parts of, into a politically kind of expedient shape, which happens to suit the agenda of NHS or service commissioners. You know, it's kind of back to the roots, which is kind of what Jay was saying, bottom up.
That's great. Thank you for that. And finally, Erin, what are your thoughts? I think I know what your answer is going to be.
Well, I mean, I just think we have to go back and look at the research, because I think there was a number of issues with the research. I think before any research was carried out, there really should have been a really thorough kind of assessment of what the potential harms are. I think that was really missing. And I think, I mean, I focus in on diversity there, and there really should have been a kind of review of what the impact of such a project would have on diversity in the profession. And that hasn't happened prior to the research, which I really think it should have. I think there are potential conflicts of interest in terms of the fact that, you know, whether coincidentally, I'm sure, but certain trainings are privileged, and some of those trainings are connected to the organisations that were involved in mapping the project. And just from a kind of purely ethical research basis, that's probably something that should have been kind of declared and mitigated at the outset. And I just think there should have been full consultation prior to research, because the research is already done at the end of the day. So any changes to the framework at this point are still going to be rooted in the research, and it's the research that's really where the root of the problem is. So my answer, again, not surprisingly, is I think that this project needs to be scrapped, and I think we need to go right back to the beginning. We need to look at and really, really clearly define what the problem is, because I don't think that's been defined. And until the problem's defined, I don't see how you can start to solve it. So I think we need to kind of, you know, the whole profession, not just the membership bodies, in fact, but, you know, all kinds of different interested parties really need to get together and figure out what the problem is that we're trying to solve here, and how we can go about it in a way that isn't harmful, that's respectful of different modalities, and it's just fair, because I think that's what's missing. So yeah, scrap scoped is my answer.
Thanks, Erin. Well, that brings us kind of to the end of our panel discussion. I mean, I don't know about anybody else, but I've got a lot to think about in all of those discussions that we've had today. I just really want to thank everybody on the panel, because I really appreciate you giving up your time to kind of come and discuss these issues. And I know it's not difficult actually in this climate to kind of come and share some of these views. So really appreciate that. And thank you everybody for watching. I think we've had hundreds of people kind of watching us live today, which is absolutely fantastic on a Monday afternoon. And obviously we will have this recorded and people can watch it afterwards if they haven't been able to come today. Thank you, Kaz, for co-hosting with me. Do you want to do the final sign off?
I will, yes. Thank you too, Peter. It's always a pleasure. And just thank you so much to the panel. Really, really appreciate you being here. This has just felt like a great discussion. And like Peter said, it's actually not easy to come along and talk about a subject like this out in the public ether. So yeah, just really so much thanks. Yeah, as Peter said, the discussion has been recorded, so you'll find that on the YouTube channel. It will definitely be there. We're not sure if it will be there straight away, but it will definitely be there from tomorrow. And then for more articles and opinions on SCoPED, you can also access our website, www.therapists-connect.com. Or follow us on Twitter, and please also follow our panel members as well on my own Twitter account. I've put all of their Twitter handles, and I've put Emma's Facebook account. She has a Facebook page and she's not on Twitter. So yeah, feel free to follow us. We're going to be holding, this is just the first debate, we're going to be holding more debates, and the next one is going to be over the next coming weeks under the banner of Trainee Talk, #Trainee Talk. People on Twitter will know that this is our regular student discussion that we have. So we're going to be focusing on the issues that students are raising with regards to the SCoPE project. And if you're a student and you want to actually take part in that, then please contact myself or Peter or the TherapistsConnect social media account for more information. And I just want to say, everyone who's watching, thank you for watching. Yeah, really take some time to let all of this sink down. And please also just take care, because there is a lot going on. You know, there is a lot of uncertainty. There's a lot of different emotion. I, for one, think it's really important, and I know Peter agrees, I'm sure the panelists do as well, that we all get involved, we engage in whatever way we can. That's going to look different for different people. But also know when to self-care, know when to step back, and just, yeah, please look after yourselves.
Can I just say thank you, Kaz and Peter as well, because you've done an absolutely brilliant job of facilitating today. So thank you for giving up your time and for organising all of this.
Thank you so much, Erin. Appreciate it. Yeah, so our accounts are open, TherapistsConnect accounts, if anyone wants to contact us about anything. Other than that, yeah, we'll all say goodbye. I'm going to say, yeah, say goodbye to your panel, and we'll end it there.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.